Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony. A little while back, I was fortunate enough to be able to visit the Mediterranean island nation of Cyprus. Cyprus is absolutely phenomenal. I loved every second I was able to spend there. The scenery was gorgeous, the beach is phenomenal, the food absolutely amazing. I was soaking in all the culture. It was just absolutely amazing. But while I was there, I could not pass up the opportunity to go out, explore, and learn about one of the world's most interesting and ancient beer histories, and compound the fact that it's often either overlooked or just kind of forgotten. I knew that I had to dive in and learn everything I could about Cypriot beer history. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the entire history of beer in Cyprus, and we're going to learn exactly what makes Cypriot beer so special. Now, if we're being honest, I really didn't think Cypriot beer would be that interesting or that fascinating because several years back, if you remember, I did a complete deep dive into the beer history of Malta, another Mediterranean island nation. And even though I did find some interesting nuggets, enough to make a video about, it was kind of sparse, if we're being honest, and that's because of the insane harsh climate that the islands in the Mediterranean experience. It's incredibly dry, it's incredibly hot, both things that are not ideal for beer making, and Malta in particular has a particular problem where they have extreme difficulties with agriculture in general. So going to Cyprus, I kind of had the feeling that it might be kind of the same, maybe a little bit different here and there. I'd heard some things, but I largely thought it was just going to be a repeat of Malta. I could not have been more wrong. Whereas Malta is dry, desertous, arid, poor agriculture, Cyprus is desertous. It's much the same, but because the island is so much bigger than Malta, you do get a little bit more variance in the climate, which does allow for much greater agricultural capabilities. So whereas the Maltese really struggled until basically the modern era to consistently produce beer, Cyprus has been doing it for thousands of years, since people basically inhabited the island. Evidence of Cypriot beer production reaches back to the Bronze Age in the ancient city of Kition. Kition, located in the modern city of Larnaca, was once a thriving metropolis founded by Mycenaean Greeks in the 13th century BC. Archaeological excavations of Kition have uncovered pottery, tools, and materials all used for the production of beer, as well as tablets describing the production and export of beer to other regions, which is fascinating because that record of beer exportation kind of indicates that beer was a thriving, booming industry in early Cyprus. One of the foundational tenets of their economy. It was one of the things that we frequently saw in Mesopotamia, we saw in Egypt, we saw in early Europe. Beer exportation is one of the defining factors of a thriving beer industry. It means it's gone from just household beer production, for sustenance, for nutrition, that type thing, to being a full-on business. So seeing it occur all the way back in Bronze Age Cyprus is amazing. This early Kition beer is assessed to have been a rustic porridge-style beer made from barley, wheat, and other starchy grains, similar to those beers found in nearby Egypt and Anatolia. They were likely filled with crushed grain particles that would have needed to be filtered during consumption. There would have been no hops used in these beers, but they were possibly flavored with herbs, fruits, and spices before being spontaneously fermented to approximately 5% ABV based off the recreations we've seen in the modern era. I really can't overlook the fact that these beers would have been probably pretty good in comparison to a lot of the other beers in that region and era, because a lot of the other beers, based off the descriptions I've seen, were kind of but flavored in regards to how charred the malts were and things of that nature. But based off of all the evidence I've seen off early Cypriot beer, they were using tons of herbs, fruits, and spices to really enhance the flavor of the beer. It seemed like they were really focusing on making enjoyable, delicious beers. All across the island, there's all types of amazing plants that could have been used and are still used in the modern era, such as this carob pod. If you've never heard of carob, basically it's a little tiny seed-like seed, but it has a very unique taste. They kind of grind it up and they make coffee and chocolate out of it. And I actually ate some carob chocolate, and I gotta say, even though I wasn't particularly fond of it, I could see it being a adequate chocolate substitute. So, I mean, if they were throwing carob pods into the beer based off of some of the evidence I've seen, that could have been some of the first like chocolatey flavored beers. So, I mean, the early Cypriot brewers, they knew what they were doing. They were on to craft beer before we even thought of it. However, beer production in Bronze Age Cyprus was not limited solely to the cities, as seen in small settlements around the island, such as the Pithos House near the city of Paphos. The Pithos House is a recreation of a typical Bronze Age family home along the western Cypriot coast. Excavations of this site found an abundance of information about early beer brewing in Cyprus, to include pottery, with ingredient residue, charred grains, and tools used for the brewing process. But most importantly, it gave excellent insight into what beer brewing was like in these conditions. Now, I actually took a taxi out of Paphos into the middle of nowhere. When you look up all the reviews and everything about the Pithos House on like Google, they're like, oh yeah, it's in the town of Paphos. It's not. It's about a 45-minute drive out into the middle of nowhere. And they just dropped me off at this little dirt driveway, basically. And I had to walk up into kind of like the Mediterranean jungle woods is the best way to kind of describe it. Luckily, I stumbled across it. But it was really funny. The taxi driver was actually like, I really don't want to let you out here. Like, you're probably not going to make it back. Like, how are you going to get in touch with a taxi driver? And then if they come all the way out there, you know, like, are you actually going to be able to get on the phone with them? Or are they actually going to be able to find you? She was very nervous about the whole thing, but I convinced her, she let me out, I went on my way, and I was just so happy to have been there. It was amazing. It was absolutely worth the risk of walking about 2.5 hours back to town, and in that blistering summer heat, I probably would have died, but it would have been worth it. Hidden in the trees, the Pithos House stood as a stark visage of early human life. So we're at the historic archaeological site known as the Pithos House. The Pithos House is located near the tourist town of Paphos on the western coast of Cyprus. Now, the Pithos House is one of the most important archaeological sites for all of Cypriot beer history, because it was here where we saw a lot of the earliest evidence, you know. Over in Larnaca, we had the tablets that were talking about beer sales and everything like that. But here, we actually had Neolithic evidence of pottery and scorched grains and serving vessels, clay works, that all indicate that beer was brewed here in the Pithos House. Now, obviously, if you look around, this is not the original. This is not the OG Pithos House. This is a modern-day replica, a recreation of what this site would have looked like in Neolithic time periods, right? But there's still so much information we can learn from it. For example, this would have really shown what brewing would have been like during this time period, you know. It would have been inside the home. It would have been a household duty responsibility, you know. If you wanted to drink your beer, get your nutrition, you're gonna have to make it, you know, in your own house. And there's a single fireplace there on the floor. There's some vents in the roof where the smoke would have been able to rise and head out, but it would have been a single operation going on inside of a single family home, you know. And, you know, it probably fermented in here as well, because just walking from outside to inside, the temperature dropped like 10 to 15 degrees just because of how cold and how shaded it is, as well as all the amazing insulation going on. It feels really nice in here. I'm kind of sweaty, if you can tell. But this is all very important, this climate control, because brewing in this ancient Neolithic Cypriot fashion would have led to a lot of spoilage, you know. There was no real climate control. There was no fermentation control. Everything would have been spontaneously fermented. So you would need to take every precaution you could. And honestly, when you look at like these dirt floors in here, it makes me think possibly they took some inspiration from the Natufians over in modern-day Israel and Palestine, or possibly the Anatolians, where they would ferment their beers underground. They would go inside their houses, which were a bit better to
deal with the harsh climate of the region, as I mentioned earlier, but they would dig down into the dirt, place their jars and vessels of fermenting beer down in there. That way it would get even colder and be even more temperature stable. Once the fermentation was done, they'd dig it up and serve it out and everything, probably from boil to consumption in less than like a week or two, to prevent spoilage. But man, it's so cool being able to see, this recreated, this get a real life understanding of what Neolithic brewing was like. It's just absolutely amazing. When I go out on my little beer hunting adventures, trying to find like beer history and everything, like this is exactly what I want. This is what I'm looking for.
What's so interesting about the Pithos House and the beers brewed in Kition is that was just kind of the way beers were brewed in Cyprus. Basically, from the time that people initially got there all the way up until the Romans got there, there was constantly changing demographics there. The Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Romans, various Greek cultures, because Cyprus was kind of seen as like a stopover location. So people would frequently come there on their way to Europe, on their way to the Middle East, on their way to Africa. So it was constantly facing demographic changes through immigration, through wars. Cyprus was frequently being conquered, kind of up to the modern era. We'll talk about that later. But it's interesting to know that there wasn't a whole lot of evidence that suggests that beer brewing in Cyprus truly drastically changed for hundreds and hundreds of years, despite all these new, cultures, seafaring peoples, nations, regime changes, so much change, yet the beer kind of stayed the same. I will say that during the large Greek and Roman periods, there probably was a huge push for wine to become the primary, alcoholic fermented beverage on the island, but there's still evidence of beer being brewed throughout it. There's just not a whole lot of change in its production. I will say that during the time of the Greeks and the Romans, there was some amazing innovations in beer serving and storage vessels, such as the big amphoras. And if you were to visit the archaeology museum in Nicosia, you would see some of the most mind-blowing pottery of all time. So many different like vessels that were used for beer serving, wine serving, olive oil pouring, all these different things. But that was kind of the big change and the big jump there. Absolutely amazing, phenomenal pottery, but not a whole lot of evidence to suggest that the actual production of the beer changed. Beer in Cyprus would only truly change after it was conquered by various Arab and Muslim cultures. And by change, what I'm really trying to say is that because they brought their culture that is stricter on the consumption and production of alcohol, what I really mean is that it was kind of pushed to the fringes. I haven't seen any articles that say it was strictly stopped. I haven't seen any articles that say it was 100% purely outlawed and banned, but what I have seen is that it was likely pushed to the fringes. It was more of like a closely guarded secret or a loosely enforced law, but the days of it being a actual big industry kind of gone. Now, one of the reasons I think beer production in Cyprus never truly stopped was because there were basically two periods where beer production would have been like outlawed, right? So you had the Umayyad invasion from the Umayyad Caliph, probably butchering that pronunciation. And then later on, you had the Ottoman Empire, right? And in between those two periods, there were tons of times where they were taken over and controlled by various European nations and other beer brewing cultures. So there was likely short, hundreds of years stints where beer wasn't produced, but then it would go back and people would come, they would bring back the beer industry. People would be able to drink and consume alcohol much more frequently, much more openly. And then, it eventually went back to a period where they weren't. I think the longest period where beer production would have been truly outlawed in Cyprus was between the 16th and 19th century when the Ottoman Empire owned it. Now, that's kind of interesting because in the Ottoman Empire, in other stories I've covered, like Malta and in Turkey itself. There were exceptions where the Ottomans kind of either taxed or just kind of looked the other way when it came to alcohol production and alcohol consumption, right? So I don't have any strong evidence to suggest that that was the take that they took on Cyprus, but I think it's plausible to make an assumption, an educated guess, that beer production still probably occurred on Cyprus, just to a much lesser degree. Now, this dark period of will they brew beer was rapidly pushed to the side in the 19th century when the Ottomans actually gave control over Cyprus to the United Kingdom, because the Ottomans were fearing a full-on war with Russia, and they made an agreement with the United Kingdom that if they gave them Cyprus, they would use it as a military base essentially, and they would be able to help provide security to the Ottomans against Russia in case of war or invasion. Now, the Brits, big beer drinkers. So as soon as they got to Cyprus, they really started bringing back beer. They started developing beer brewing industries. They started setting up breweries all across the island. Now, I will say that these facilities were largely focused on serving beer to the soldiers, sailors of the United Kingdom, but a lot of locals kind of got in on the money-making business. They started opening up their own breweries and they started producing their own beer in the fashion of the United Kingdom's beer stylings, but still, it was nice to see that the beer brewing industry on Cyprus was thriving once again. Now, what I will say is interesting about beer production during British Cyprus is that is a very similar story that we saw happen over in Malta. Malta was also a Mediterranean island nation that was at one point in time under the control of the UK military. Now, over in Malta, they started largely focusing on ale production. A lot of ale beers, your blonde ales, your porters, your stouts, that type thing. And it was because lager production was incredibly difficult in Malta because it is a hot, dry, desertous climate. But that's also what we saw in Cyprus. It is a hot, dry, desertous island, right? The climates are comparable. But over in Cyprus, in British Cyprus, what we really saw was lager production basically from the get-go. Now, I don't know if it was just because of the time difference. There was a little bit of a time gap between UK Cyprus and UK Malta. So maybe lagers became a bit more popular in England at that point in time. But all I know is that if you look at it in black and white on paper, it seems like if ales thrived in Malta, ales should have thrived in Cyprus as well, and lagers would have floundered because lagers need cold, climate-controlled conditions to be able to produce good, clean, delicious tasting lagers. And both of these nations really didn't have that going for them because it's so freaking hot there. So I don't really have a solid answer why lager was the primary focus of production in Cyprus as opposed to the ales in Malta, but I am really happy they did because I'm telling you, I tried tons of craft beer while I was in Cyprus and it was insanely hot, and it was the lagers that really hit for me, the big beer produced lagers, which we'll talk about here in a second. The English had brought beer back to Cyprus, and as I said, it was primarily focused on being produced for the sailors and soldiers who were stationed there in case of a war with Russia, but it became a thriving industry all on its own, and it was probably the first taste of industrialized beer production that Cyprus had ever seen, going from rustic to basically home brews and then boom, right into the industrial era. The most important of these new breweries was known as the Leon Brewery. Leon beer is a nice, crisp, clean, golden lager, and it is phenomenal. It is absolutely delicious. It hits the spot perfectly, in my opinion, but it quickly became the golden standard of beer produced in Cyprus. It does stand out a bit from other continental pale lagers by being a slight bit sweeter with a pleasant grainy underflavor. And according to many of the sources I came across, there were decades where Leon became the only beer produced on Cyprus because they grew so expansively. They were the golden standard, as I said, and they just out capitalized all the other breweries there to the point where they were producing all the beer on Cyprus. There were other imports coming in at that time, but if you wanted true Cypriot beer, Leon was the one. And according to some sources, the only one. It wasn't until 1951 that Leon saw a true competitor, and that was the Keo brewery. Keo is also a golden pale, crisp, clean lager, but in comparison to Leon, which I can only assume was based off of English style pale lager brewing, Keo was actually crafted, created, and designed by Czech brewers in what was then Yugoslavia. This probably isn't a fair comparison, but where Leon was basically your Budweiser, Keo was your Budvar. Now, interestingly, Keo is unpasteurized, which is kind of unheard of in big beer industrial lager production, not so much in some of your European nations, but even still in Germany and modern day Czech Republic, you still see pasteurized lagers, right? Because they're so easy to spoil. So it's interesting that Keo, they're unfiltered, they're unpasteurized, and they say they're able to do that because of their insanely high cleanliness standards. So that's pretty cool in my opinion. Keo is a bit crisper and hoppier, likely due to being designed by Czech brewers, so it kind of replicates a Czech Pilsner, but that makes it a bit more preferred in my personal opinion. I kind of like the hoppier bite. To me, this is actually kind of an interesting period as well, even though a lot of people kind of aren't as interested in that like industrial period of beer brewing. I think it was pretty interesting in Cyprus because you started seeing kind of factions and the island being kind of divided up. Oh, I'm a Keo drinker. Oh, I'm a Leon drinker. Oh, this is a Keo town, kind of similar to how we saw like in between the 60s and the 80s between Miller, Coors, Anheuser over here in America. Everyone knows that one guy that's like, oh, I'm a Coors guy, everyone has their favorite beer. I just thought that was interesting to see that happening on Cyprus. This could have been a incredible golden era of beer production in Cyprus because when you have two big breweries competing against each other, that usually results in innovation or price cuts or something in order to like edge over each other. But it kind of piddled out before it really got going because the Carlsberg brewery over in Denmark, they decided that they wanted to start producing beer in Cyprus. So they signed a contract with the Leon brewery where, hey, you're going to produce Carlsberg in Cyprus, the first nation outside of Denmark itself to produce Carlsberg. For some reason, the Leon brewery stopped Leon beer. They stopped producing their own beers to focus solely on producing Cypriot Carlsberg, which is the same recipe and everything as Danish Carlsberg, just brewed in Cyprus. Now, I wasn't able to find an exact reason why they decided to stop Leon beer altogether. Maybe they saw it, maybe it's just more profitable to just produce Carlsberg. Maybe that was in the contract with Carlsberg that you're only going to produce our beer. Maybe they didn't have enough storage, enough facility, enough capability to produce two lines of beer at the same time and meet the demand of what their contractual obligation with Carlsberg was. Regardless, instantly, Keo became the only Cypriot beer. From the fall of Leon, Keo grew immensely. I think it now holds like 35% of all beer produced in Cyprus, which is amazing. But during that time, other breweries started popping up here and there, and none of them really truly rivaled Keo until Leon came back in the 2000s. It wasn't until 2003 when Leon Lager reemerged onto the market. It utilized the exact same recipe and the ingredients that it used all the way back in the 1930s. So it was like, boom, a bit of beer history back in the market. Now, Keo was still very competitive, but they just really couldn't compete with Leon because Leon was producing its Leon Lager. It also had a couple other lager lines underneath it, different brands, and it was still producing Carlsberg, Cypriot Carlsberg. So Leon rapidly shot back up to controlling over 50% of the total beer production and sales on Cyprus. And that's kind of where we're at today. Two major competing lager brands. And if you travel from town to town, different parts of Cyprus, you will still see that kind of divide. I'm a Leon town, I'm a Keo town, I'm a Keo restaurant, I'm a Leon restaurant. Very rarely will you ever go anywhere and see both of them on the menu at the same time. It's kind of interesting that way. And that kind of brings us to the modern era. In the 2010s, Cyprus, just like every other country on the planet, became enamored and captured by craft beer. Dozens of microbreweries started popping up all over the island nation, and you started seeing a huge emergence of interesting and delicious styles. So it's stouts, IPAs, sours, all these different types of beers, heavily influenced by American style craft beer. Based off of my experience there, you'll see a lot of breweries there being like American stout, American IPA, as opposed to, kind of here in America where there's a lot of like English and German influence as well. Everything seemed to be American style. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the primary economic factor in Cyprus is tourism. A lot of Americans travel to Cyprus to experience their amazing beaches and everything. And you do see a lot of Europeans travel there as well, probably more Europeans than Americans. But whereas all these other beer brewing nations, Germany, England, even Italy, France, whatever, they all have their own kind of culture and history of beer, but everybody's kind of enamored by American style craft beer. That's one of the big things we have going for us. So if a German is traveling to Cyprus, they likely don't want to try English style IPA because they would just go to England, right? And if an American comes over, they're just going to drink American because that's how Americans are. Anyways, that was a bit of a tangent. I just thought it was interesting. But what really interested me as I was going through Cypriot craft beer was finding the beers that utilized the local native ingredients. You could find carob stouts. You could find all these different types of herbs and spices in beers. I think one of the ones that I thought was most interesting was Cyprus had a Cypriot grape ale, very similar to the style of the Italian grape ale. A bit tart, a bit fruity with all the grape juice in it, kind of like a beer wine hybrid, but they used Cypriot grape varietals that they would have actually used in Cypriot wine production. I actually had an amazing experience where I was able to crack open a Cypriot grape ale with a true wine sommelier, and he seemed to have liked it enough. He was able to taste the varietal and talk about it a little bit. It seemed like he liked it. Maybe he was humoring me a little bit, but while I was doing this tasting with him, I thought it was so interesting to compare the wine and the grape ale and see, hey, they're taking their local ingredients, their local culture, their local take on the grander process of beer brewing, especially in the craft scene, really allowing that Cypriot history and culture of beer production to show through in their own craft beers. I will say they were a bit scarce and a bit few and far between finding beers like that, and I would like to see much more of an adoption of Cypriot ingredients in craft beer, but what I was able to find was delicious and amazing and highly, highly welcomed. I don't usually give endorsements like this, but I will say that if you are going to visit any craft brewery in Cyprus, I highly, highly recommend the Golem Brewery up in Nicosia. Every single one of their beers was absolutely phenomenal, delicious. I really enjoyed their beers, and I couldn't find another place that could really fit them into this conversation, so give them a try. They're delicious. All right, now this is where this video is going to get a bit controversial. We cannot talk about the modern beer landscape in Cyprus without talking about the ongoing dispute with Northern Cyprus, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. I'm going to make a little bit of a disclaimer here. I am simply going to make statements about the facts and about my experience in Northern Cyprus because I understand it is a highly debated topic. There is a lot of passion and emotions and hurt on both sides of this argument. And I'm not trying to rile any of it up as an outsider. I have no place, no dog in that fight. I am simply going to state the facts and my experience. So don't ask me for my opinions on any of this because ultimately it doesn't matter and I'm not going to share them anyway. Following nearly a century of political, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions, Turkey invaded an independent Cyprus in 1974, annexing the northern portion of the island, which Turkey then established the largely unrecognized nation of Northern Cyprus, also known as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The annexation resulted in a large demographic migration of Greek Cypriots moving south and Turkish Cypriots moving north, resulting in a semi-segregated island. If you visit Nicosia in Cyprus, which is one of the largest cities of Cyprus, tons to see and tons to do there, there is a divide right in the middle of town, right? A full-on militarized border. It is patrolled by the UN. They're there as peacekeepers, and you actually have to go through a border check. You'll get stamped coming out, you'll get stamped coming in, vice versa, onto both sides of the Greek side and the Turkish side. As some of you know, I actually lived in Turkey for a period of time, so I had a strong interest in crossing that border known as the Green Zone, and I wanted to visit Northern Cyprus. And I wanted to see what was going on over there, and I wanted to see what the beer industry was like over there. And I will say that it did feel a bit of a culture shock. I've heard arguments that Cyprus itself doesn't have its own cultural identity, which I disagree with, but because there is a lot of Turkish and a lot of Greek influence on the island, people say, oh, they're just Greeks. Oh, they're just Turks. You know, they just live on a different island, right? Again, no dog in this fight. That's just what I'm saying. I disagree with that sentiment. I believe Cyprus has its own amazing, thriving culture. Although there is a lot of similarities, I think they do it in their own unique way. I will say, when I crossed the green zone into Northern Cyprus, it did feel like a culture shock. It felt like I was walking right back into Istanbul or Anatolia, Cheshme, Bodrum. It felt like I was in a whole different country. I'm not making a statement. I'm just saying how it felt. Okay? Don't get mad at me. As soon as I crossed the green zone, the food was exactly like I remember in Turkey. The buildings, the architecture, the people, they all looked, smelled, tasted, felt just like I was back in Turkey. And that includes the beer. Now, based off all the research I was able to find, there was either an extremely limited number of craft breweries in the northern part of Cyprus that were either closed that day, because I think I was there on a Sunday, and but I was able to find some craft beer shops, right? Some restaurants that serve craft beer and some beer-centric tap house type things. And I will say that a lot of the beers there were welcome sights to my eyes. I was able to find Garaguzu, which is one of my favorite Turkish. It is my favorite Turkish craft brewery. They make the best beer in Turkey, hands down, undeniable fact. And I never thought I'd get to try or experience Garaguzu again. When am I going to find myself back in Turkey? So I was extremely happy to be able to drink Garaguzu again, right? I will say it's a shame that a culture, a people, a nation has to be divided for me to be able to experience that again, but I was happy to try Garaguzu. There's nowhere else in Cyprus I think I would have been able to find it. I never saw anything other than Cypriot or European/American imports in the rest of Cyprus. But as soon as I crossed the border, it was all Turkish beers. And again, no opinion. I just thought that was interesting. And that kind of brings us to the modern era. There is so much history and there's so much fascinating things to uncover and discover about Cypriot beer. I'm sure as future archaeological discoveries, occur, we will learn much, much more about Cypriot beer, early Greek brewing, early Mediterranean brewing in general. And that's always fascinating because that's just another, maybe a footnote, maybe a whole nother chapter in the oldest story of beer. There's also still so much room for the modern Cypriot craft beer industry. I would really love to see them capitalize on natural Cypriot organic ingredients and stuff like that. Really bring their own cultural identity and their own history into their beers instead of just replicating what the tourists want, like Maybe I'm selfish, but if I go to Cyprus, I don't want an American IPA. I want a Cypriot IPA. So I do think there is a lot of room, a lot of growth, and as people continue to flock to Cyprus, maybe we will start to see some of that innovation taking a stronger foothold. I believe that the beer history of Cyprus has many, many, many more chapters ahead of it, and I'm extremely excited to see where it goes. I am desperate to go back and visit Cyprus again one day in the future and just see how much it's changed and how much it's evolved and how much we've learned from one of the earliest chapters of beer brewing history. So if you ever get the opportunity, I highly recommend you take it all in, because it's one of the places where you're going to be able to truly connect with early beer history, with their archaeological sites, with their amazing beers they're brewing in the modern era. So thank you for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there is a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.